As we ended chapter 5, Petrov and the bear stood watch at Big Root's entrance while Nightlight sat just outside the window. His guard was up. The night was too still. Something was wrong. Something was coming. Chapter 6, Amazing Discoveries and Ancient Magic. While Catherine was telling her bedtime story, North was studying the sword the man in the moon had bestowed upon him. He knew he was in a race against time. Pitch would return, and when he did, Nicholas St. North wanted to be ready. He prided himself on being the best swordsman in the world. Indeed, in his bandit days, he had once defeated an entire cavalry regiment with nothing more than a bent steak knife. But this sword was, blast it, confounding. Etched on its handle in a clear, handsome script was the name, Tsar Lunar the 11th. The man in the moon's father had been the last Tsar or ruler of the Golden Age, and his sword had been crafted with more care than even North himself was capable of. North had hammered out many a fine weapon, even some forged from bits of ancient meteor, but nothing like this amazing blade. It never seemed heavy. No matter how long North practiced with it, its hilt closed tightly round his hand whenever he began to wield it, then loosened when he was ready to put it away. It could slice whole boulders in half with one slash. It wasn't a sword for slaying your average enemy, that was certain. But he needed to understand all of its hidden powers. How else would he make the best use of it, especially against Pitch? The Yetis did what they could to help. The crafty warriors possessed an amazing arsenal of arrow guns, pikes, bludgeons, spears, dirks, knucklers, and daggers. And they used all of them against this amazing sword. North was victorious every time, but it wasn't always his skill that won today. It was the blade itself. The sword had a mind of its own. It would leap from its sheath and into North's hand whenever there was danger. Even during the friendly pretend attacks of the Yetis, it seemed to guide him to block an opponent's every thrust. Well, this piqued North's pride. The sounds of him yelling, "Quit that! I'm the best swordsman who ever breathed air," and "Do what I say, you ancient pile of stardust," could often be heard echoing through the lamasery during sword practice. That morning in a practice battle with Yalu, the fierce and friendly leader of the Yetis, North vanquished the hairy giant easily, and Yalu carried the most feared of all Yeti weapons, an abominable mood swing. An abominable mood swing, most feared of all Yeti weapons. Yalu didn't seem to mind, but North was starting to feel sorry for him. "You'll get me next time," North said with a good-natured chuckle. As he reached up to shake hands with Yalu, the sword flew from his grasp. It appeared determined to fall from the tower. North grabbed wildly for it, but it was too quick. He and Yalu looked down in horror. Tashi, one of Yalu's lieutenants, was just below with the Grand High Lama. They were both standing on their heads, meditating. The sword was headed straight for them. What does one shout to a meditating Yeti and an ancient warrior moon monk when a magic sword is about to impale them? North wondered fleetingly. "Get off your heads before you lose them," he bellowed. Then a remarkable thing happened. As the weapon neared them, it stopped its fall. It hovered in the air for a moment, then began to rise. It hovered in the air for a moment, then began to rise. North reached out, his hand beginning to tingle, and even though the sword was 100 feet below, it instantly flew back up to him and slapped into his palm with a satisfying thwack. Down below, Tashi and the Grand High Lama remained in their headstands, completely unaware of their near demise. North turned the weapon over and over in wonder. The sword had fallen on purpose to show him one of its secrets, that it could change direction to avoid causing harm. So he tried to test its sharpness with his thumb, but the sword's tip pulled away. Can the sword wound only my enemies? He asked out loud. Yalu motioned for him to try and slice him. North paused, but Yalu was adamant. So North took a breath and then slashed the blade directly toward Yalu. The Yeti didn't flinch, and once again the sword veered off, refusing to cause harm. The blasted thing! I expect a sword to do what I want. Why give me a weapon that fights against me? North fumed. The Yeti eyed North with an amused expression. Perhaps the sword is fighting for you, he suggested. That pleased North. He was nodding in agreement when he heard a quiet behind him. North turned. Ombric stood there. He seemed eager to talk. I've been working on something that might help us, the wizard said, as if picking up from a prior conversation, one that had nothing to do with North's sword. North saw great excitement in the wizard's eyes. Ombric had already discovered that the llamas had a magnificent clock that recorded every second of time. Recorded every second of time. It was one of the few possessions the llamas had been able to bring to Earth before Pitch had destroyed their home planet. They told Ombric the clock was as old as time itself, and it could send its user back a day, a year, or even an eon. The wizard had been relentlessly studying the great round clock. He couldn't believe that he, the Prince of Invention, had never tried to create such a marvel himself. The clock, more than 30 feet high, looked like nothing he had ever seen before. It was made up of dozens of interlocking rings that spun and rotated inside of one another. The rings were formed from a pale metal known only on the llama's home planet. And in the center stood a column of round clock faces of various sizes. These were used to set the clock to the exact time and place in history to which one wanted to journey. With some trial and error, Ombric had learned how to go on short visits into the past. No matter how much time he actually spent in the past, he returned to the present within minutes of when he left. Everyone in the Llamaderry got used to seeing him pop out of nowhere with fantastic tales of his adventures. One day, he told Catherine he went to see the Great Pyramid of Giza being built. Good thing they'd learned to levitate solid rock back then, or they would never have finished the thing, the wizard declared. Odd, though, that it was once topped with an egg-shaped stone. After another journey, he landed in the middle of the courtyard at the Llamaderry, red-faced and panting, a large tear in his robe. North had never seen the wizard so out of sorts. What's wrong, old man? He asked. Most dinosaurs are really very friendly creatures, Ombric answered once he caught his breath. But those Rex fellows, Tyrannosaurus, a bit snappy when hungry. All of these journeys back and forth through time made for interesting stories, but North didn't see how they could help them defeat Pitch. But this time, Ombric planned to do more than merely go back in time. I'm going to travel back to the moment when Pitch attacked the moon, he told North. I'll be able to see exactly where the relics fell. Finding them is our best hope of defeating him. And off he went. But this trip, something unusual, baffling even, occurred. Ombric was very disturbed as he told them his latest adventure. They were eating supper in the busy dining hall of the Llamaderry. Yetis, llamas, and snow geese ate noisily as he related what had happened. And here's what Ombric said. Very interesting. I was back in time just before the last battle of the Golden Age, he told them. I could see Pitch's ship hiding on the dark side of Earth, lying in wait to attack the moon. As you remember, Pitch destroyed and wrought havoc to end the golden age. Suddenly it occurred to me to warn the man in the moon and his family. I hoped to stop this whole history before it could even begin. But I sensed someone standing next to me. I turned to look, and there, to my utter amazement, floating beside me, was a most curious fellow. He was at least 7 feet tall, wearing robes of a most peculiar design, and holding a long staff with an egg-shaped jewel at one end. Oh. Who was he? Did he say anything? Asked Catherine. He did indeed, confirmed the wizard. One word, which he repeated. Naughty, naughty. Is that it? North demanded, lowering his soup spoon. Not quite, explained Ombric. He touched my shoulder with the jeweled egg, and I suddenly found myself back here. You've told me of many strange things, Ombric, but this takes the soup, said North, sipping again at his dinner. I left out perhaps the strangest part, added the wizard ominously. The fellow's ears. Yes, said North. Ombric leaned forward. Mr. North, he said with dramatic relish, they were the ears of a gigantic rabbit. Chapter 7, A Tall Tale for a Rabbit. Catherine and North simply did not know what to say about a 7-foot-tall talking rabbit. They'd seen so many amazements with the great wizard, but this struck them as, well, outstandingly odd. North was the first to voice his doubts. An interstellar talking rabbit man, he questioned. Are you sure all this time travel isn't scrambling your brains? Ombric raised an eyebrow at his former pupil. It does sound very unusual, added Catherine. Ombric's eyebrow rose even higher. He was stunned that they doubted him. His temper began to rise. Then his mustache began to twist into tight curls. But then Ombric remembered that he, too, had doubted the existence of this rabbit when he'd first read about him in an ancient text from Atlantis. In fact, he discounted the creature as merely a myth until he saw it floating next to him. If I'm not mistaken, began the wizard in his most patient teacher voice, this rabbit man, as you call him, is a Pooka, the rarest and most mysterious creature in the universe. A Pooka, the rarest and most mysterious creature in the universe. North and Catherine were intrigued. It was their eyebrows that rose now. They are among the oldest creatures in creation, continued Ombric. So little is known about them, and even less understood. It is said that they oversee the health and well-being of planets. This Pooka is mysterious indeed, interrupted the Grand High Lama. He and the Lamas stood serenely in their usual V formation. They'd entered the room, as always, in complete silence and had startled our heroes with their arrival. You know him, it? Asked Ombric, visibly surprised. We know he is a him, not an it, replied a tallish Lama. We know he has a vast knowledge, said another. We know he is difficult to know, said the shortest. We know he prefers to be unknown, said one of the others. We've heard He likes eggs, said another. And chocolate, added the shortest one. We think, concluded the Grand High Lama. They never say anything definite. We think. Catherine, North, and Ombric mulled over that uncommonly informative aria of information from the llamas. A robe-wearing rabbit man who time travels and likes eggs, summarized North, trying not to laugh. And chocolate, said Catherine mischievously. A substance he apparently invented, interjected the Grand High Lama. I thought I invented chocolate, said Ombric indignantly. That, my dear Ombric, is what the Pooka wants you to think, replied a llama. We think, added another. Ombric shook his head in confusion. I'm going time traveling. At least the past is certain. That much I do know. But do not tamper with events in the past, warned the High Lama. It is forbidden, said the tallest llama. And the Pooka will not like it, said another. As the wizard entered the time machine and made his settings, he replied, good, and vanished into the certainties of the past. North and Catherine stared at the clock for a few moments, then exchanged a concerned glance. I always worry about him when he goes back there, wherever there is, North admitted. Catherine gave a small nod. Me too. But he's a tough old bird, North reasoned, just as Kylish came waddling up and began nuzzling her head against them. This tough young bird needs some feeding, he chuckled. He picked Catherine up and set her on Kylash's back. Your goose is as big as Petrov and still growing. Want to help me feed her? Asked Catherine. Maybe tonight. I've got to keep working, North told her, reaching up to brush her hair out of her face. Her hair was always falling over one eye, and North would often brush it back. Catherine looked down at her dashing friend. She was a little worried about him, too. He'd been working so hard, trying to figure out how to use the new magic sword. That's all right. Nightlight will help me, she assured him. She thought back to the day she, North, and Ombric had bowed before the man in the moon, had pledged their oath to continue in the fight against Pitch. North had sworn to use his sword wisely and well, so study he must. She was grateful for Nightlight's help, for being a guardian was harder than any of them had realized it was about. And she was grateful for Nightlight's help, for being a guardian was harder than any of them had realized. And it was about to get harder than they'd ever imagined. Chapter 8. A hop, skip, and a jump through time. Deep inside the clock, Ombric was somersaulting through time at a furious pace. The world around him flickered from day to night faster than the blink of an eye. He saw seasons pass in seconds. Centuries flew by as he drifted up and away from the lapidary. He looked skyward as the sun and stars spiraled past him at rocket speed. Day, night, faster than could be said, and in reverse. The moon was there too, and in a flash, he saw the explosion of Pitch's galleon and the last great battle of the Golden Age, but it all happened too fast. The relics fell from the moon too quickly for him to track them. Ombric wasn't worried. He would slow down his trajectory on the return trip and take note of their whereabouts. And if his plan worked, he wouldn't need to. Take note of their whereabouts, and if his plan worked, he wouldn't need to. He began to drift away from Earth, going deeper and deeper into the vast dazzlements of space. He was traveling so swiftly through time that comets, planets, and galaxies pivoted and sparkled around him like fireworks, but their size was beyond description. Then Ombric realized that the flashes he was seeing were the deaths of the Golden Age world. What he was watching was Pitch's galleon destroying one constellation after another. Then, as Ombric continued to pinwheel back through time, the universe around him brightened. Golden Age ships coursed through the sky around him. This was it, the age he had studied for so long but never dreamed he would see. He could barely take it all in. The cities he saw were colossal, magnificent, more magical than anything he had ever imagined. It broke his heart to think of the vanished wonder and glory of this perfect era, and he became more determined than ever to implement his plan. He soon found himself at the infamous prison planet, the huge rusted dungeon where the Fearlings had been locked after the Golden Age armies had captured them. As time slowed down, he stopped his journey just moments before Pitch was overtaken and the Fearlings had escaped. Ombric hid behind a large pillar, an arm's length away from Pitch, who was standing in a guard station in front of the prison's only door. It was remarkable to see his nemesis as he had been before his change to evil. He looked every inch a great hero, stalwart, valiant, even noble in his Golden Age military uniform. But his determined expression was weary and tinged with sorrow. From behind the massive door, Ombric could hear a drone of whispers and mutterings from the prisoners. The noise would rise to a crescendo, then sink low, pulsing eerily from within. What an awful sound, thought Ombric. It's like evil itself. To hear that day after day would drive any man insane. And indeed, the ghostly noise seemed to weigh on Pitch. His face was drawn, his fists clenched in anxiety. But then he pulled a silver locket from his tunic pocket. The chain hung around his neck. He tapped the clasp, and it swung open, revealing a small photograph. Ombric could just make out the face of a little girl. Pitch stared at the image, seeming to take great solace in the picture. His face softened, and his sadness eased. Ombric knew that expression. He'd seen it countless times. It was the look of a father gazing at his child. Pitch had a daughter. The wizard could feel Pitch's longing to see his child in person. The Fearlings sensed his longing too. Their strange mutterings shifted in tone. Their pleadings took on the voice of a small girl. "Please, Daddy," they whispered, "please, please open the door." A momentary spark of hope crossed Pitch's face. His eyes lit up and then they dimmed as he recognized the sound for what it was, a Fearling trick. He visibly steeled himself against the evil, bracing his shoulders, clenching his jaw. But the Fearlings started to beg again. "Daddy," they cried, "I'm trapped in here with these shadows and I'm scared. Please open the door. Help me, Daddy, please." Pitch looked again at the photograph. The pleading grew more desperate, more hypnotic. Pitch seemed to be slipping into a trance. Suddenly, his face grew wild with panic. He reached for the door. The locket fell from his neck. Ombric caught it in midair and was about to block Pitch from opening the prison door when the mysterious Pooka reappeared. Ombric found he could neither move nor utter a sound. The Pooka held up his hand and shook his head. "That's a no-no," he scolded. The llamas had told Ombric he could not change events in his journeys through time. He could only observe them. The Pooka, it seemed, was there to stop his trying. Ombric looked from the Pooka back to Pitch in time to witness agony and shock in the jailer's eyes, the desperation of a loving father trying to save his daughter from the Fearlings. As the door swung open, all that was visible was a roiling mass of dark, serpent-like creatures. Of course, Pitch's daughter was not there. Before Pitch could even scream her name, he was surrounded by malevolent shadows. In less than an instant, they poured over, around, into him. It was a horrifying sight, one that Ombric would never forget. Pitch struggled valiantly, but he soon succumbed to the evil flooding him, twisting him into a madman. He swelled to 10 times his normal size. His face became monstrous and cruel. As Ombric stared transfixed, he felt the familiar touch of the Pooka's egg-tipped staff on his shoulder. He was sent back to the present again, but as he began to dim and vanish, he saw Pitch throw his head back and roar with the menacing laughter of 10,000 fearlings. Chapter 9. The Secret of the Sword. While Ombric was watching history unfold, North was in the Lamaderry library studying the new sword. He'd examined it for weeks with all the methods at his disposal. Magnifying glasses of every shape, size, and purpose, microscopes, maxoscopes, telescopes. He'd come to so many mystifying discoveries, it boggled his agile mind. The metal of the sword could change itself. Sometimes it was mostly iron, then it shifted to steel, then to metals that North couldn't even classify. It could become highly magnetic or immeasurably strong, and at times it could emit various kinds of light. Sunlight, moonlight, comet light, lights that had no name. North began to realize that the weapon was indeed a living thing. In battle, it would transform into a conventional sword, the long blade with protective covering over the handle. But depending on the circumstances, it would sprout various mechanical additions. In darkness, for instance, a curious light-emitting orb would appear. When danger was imminent, the jewels on the handguard would glow red. And at other times, the handguard itself would change, sometimes revealing maps of the stars, or the moon, or the earth itself. But the how and why and what of these gadgets were still a mystery to him. North thought about what Ombric always said about magic, that its real power was in belief. North knew for certain that this sword had powers beyond explanation. The sword, he hoped, could tell him what he needed most to know. So he closed his eyes and concentrated on the belief, on that belief, with all his mind and heart. I believe, I believe, I believe, he said very quietly. As he chanted the phrase over and over, his thoughts began to grow uncluttered, pure, sharp, till he had only one question. Where were the other relics? It was as if the sword now guided his mind. And then, with the subtlest of clicks, North felt the sword change. He opened his eyes to see that a metal orb had appeared. It opened, unwrapping like an intricate puzzle. Inside was a map of the earth, and on the map were 4 glittering jewels. 4 jewels. North's mind raced. 4 jewels. Were they the 4 relics they needed to find? That had to be it. Each jewel marked their position. They simply had to follow this map. Eager to share the news with the wizard, North raced through the Lamaderry, finding Ombric in the tower, just as he was reappearing from his latest time travel. I have the answer, old man, North cried, slapping him on the back. And I have new questions, said Ombric wearily. And at that moment, Catherine ran into the room. Nightlight is missing, she shouted. Revelations, chapter 10, Terror and Daring Deeds. Catherine tried to rein in her panic, but her quivering voice betrayed her. He hasn't returned since last night. No one has seen him, she explained in a rush. Both Ombric and North tensed. They knew that Nightlight's visits were as regular as clockwork. They also knew that Santov Clausen was always his last stop before he returned to the Lomondary. Only one thing could delay the lad, said North, his voice low. Pitch, whispered Catherine. Even as they spoke, Ombric was already trying to contact his owls. They were constantly on watch in his library and forever at the ready to report to him telepathically, concentrated with all his might. But the line of mental communication was severed. How could that be? He could not sense even an echo of emotion from the owls. They could not speak to him. He should at least be able to feel them, especially if they were in danger or afraid, but there was nothing. It was this nothingness that frightened him most. He spun around and caught North's eye. He didn't need to say a word. North understood immediately. To Santov Clausen, North asked, and right speedily came Ombric's answer. The question was, which method would get them there right speedily? Ombric knew he didn't have the stamina for astral projection. Time travel always left him exhausted. Besides, North and Catherine couldn't join him in that mode. The reindeer? They needed the spectral boy to guide the highways of light upon which they flew. The genie, of course, was gone. Ombric's mind was anxiously calculating all the possibilities when he was interrupted by the sudden appearance of the llamas. We have adequate conveyance, said the Grand High Lama. It is swift, said another Lama. And comfortable, added a third. And easy to pilot, agreed a shortish one. Ombric dreaded the series of answers his next question would cause. The Lamas answered questions only in fragments. Where's the craft? Ombric tried to sound patient and urgent at the same time. The Lamas looked at one another, deciding who would answer first. Ombric, North, and Catherine shifted impatiently. Time was wasting. Finally, the Grand High Lama spoke. The craft? Why, you stand within it, he said with stunning simplicity. You need merely to say where you'd like to go. This tower will rocket you there with both speed and accuracy. Then the Lamas began to shuffle silently toward the courtyard. We are certain you can handle the situation, said the Grand High Lama as they reached the arching doorway. But we suggest you sit down for the trip, said the tallest. The trajectory is most speedy, said the shortest. At least when last we used it, said another. 30,000 years ago, added the Grand Lama as he exited last. North, Ombric, and Catherine looked quizzically at one another. They each took to a chair and then glanced up at the glass-topped ceiling of the tower. It was perfect for observing a journey. We have all we need, I think, said North, gripping his sword. Catherine suppressed a smile. She knew Kailash, asleep under a nearby table, was aboard for the trip, but she thought it best to keep that to herself. Ombric turned to her. My dear, give the order. She grasped the arms of her chair tightly. To Santov Clausen as fast as, but before she could finish the sentence, they were already blasting off. Chapter 11, As the Tower Flies. The Lamas were true to their word. The tower was a marvelous airship. No sooner had they taken off than the entire interior began to mechanically transform. As the tower shifted horizontally in its trajectory, their chairs glided toward the glass ceiling. The floor began to pivot and lean, as did the walls, until they formed a sort of ship's cabin with large moon-shaped windows. The woodwork, the mosaic floor tiles, the wallpaper, the instrument panels, every aspect of the cabin took on different shapes of the moon, full or half or crescent. It was enchanting and, as promised, comfortable. North examined all the charts and instruments carefully. This screen Shows our present position, he determined, then pointed to another and another. This one our speed, this one our route, this one our time of arrival. He seemed pleased by the instrument's reading. We should be there within the hour, he told them. Catherine was relieved to hear North's prediction. To travel from the Himalayas to the farthest corner of eastern Siberia was in a matter of minutes, was an astounding thing. Even the reindeer had not been able to achieve that kind of speed. But Ombric was quiet. Catherine could tell from his expression that even this was not fast enough. Then she saw the locket clutched in his hand. "What's that?" she asked. Ombric was lost in thought and didn't seem to hear her. She gently took the locket from him and opened it to see the picture of the young girl who was close to her own age. Catherine looked intently at the lovely girl with raven black hair and haunting eyes. "She's Pitch's daughter," said Ombric, his own eyes closing as he tried in vain to reach the owl's. "I saw him holding it back in time before he became evil." Catherine was amazed. She had no memory of her own father, and though she tried to imagine what he looked like, the image in her mind was never very clear. She'd been too young when she had lost him. It was equally difficult to imagine Pitch ever being a father, or that he had ever been good. She remembered with a shudder that Pitch had vowed to turn her into a fearling princess, but mixed with that feeling of dread was now a sadness that twined with her own sense of loss and longing. Pitch had a daughter. What had happened to her? And what had happened to Nightlight? Kailash had found her way from the back of the tower. She honked, struggled to squeeze through the main door of the cabin. And with one great shove, she made it. She snuggled next to Catherine, her long neck twisting around her protectively, her feathered body a warm brace to lean against. North looked at Catherine's sorrow-filled face. He was glad that Kailash was there to comfort her. He knew from Ombric's concentrated silence that things in Santoff Closet would be perilous. So he steadied himself for the darkness that lay ahead. Chapter 12. Before we pause. Delicate darkness. Before the travelers knew it, their craft started dropping in elevation, flying lower and lower until it was practically skimming the treetops of Santoff Clausen's enchanted forest. They had to squint to see the village. Clouds blocked the moon and the stars. More unsettling was that not a single light shined from any window. The village was a shadow. The airship landed with surprising silence at the edge of the forest. North carefully opened the moon-shaped door, and they all gazed out on their village. It had never been this quiet. North looked to Ombric with a tense, questioning expression, then unsheathed the magic sword and climbed out first. "Stay behind me. Run if I say so," he told Catherine. The sword was transforming itself as he spoke, its light emerging magically from the blade. The glow lit their way. North sensed a vibration. Was the sword signaling danger? He was not sure. They walked toward Big Root, slowly scanning the mournful landscape for any signs of life. Catherine had never seen a night so black or heard a silence so quiet, not even on the night when Pitch had first found her and her friends in the forest. It was as if all the life of the place had gone away. There was no movement, no breeze, not one firefly or night bird flew to greet them. Even the raccoons and the badgers were nowhere to be seen. Catherine reached for North's hand and kept the other on Kailash's neck. "Where's everyone?" she whispered. Instead of answering her, Ombric stopped silent. Something was glinting in the light from North's sword. Ombric stooped to pick up what appeared to be a small piece of glass. He held it up to the light. It was a tiny porcelain squirrel. It was like a toy. Turning it this way and that, he said, "It appears that Pitch has further mastered the spells of enslavement." He looked troubled and began to walk forward, his eyes continuing to search the ground. Though the eerie quiet persisted, the thick cloud cover began to dissipate as the threesome made their way into the village. So at least some moonlight began to penetrate the gloom, but this simply allowed them to better see the horror all around them. In every direction, Catherine saw small porcelain versions of living things. Whole platoons of squirrels, raccoons, and foxes all looked to be frozen in mid-battle. Try as she might, Catherine couldn't keep the tears back. Had Pitch frozen everything? She nearly stumbled over the spirit of the forest. The spirit's normally flowing veils hung still and stiff. Her gemstones were dulled with the lifeless shine of ceramics. Her frozen expression was one of fierce determination. In her hands, she clasped a jeweled sword. She had clearly been petrified at a moment of intense struggle, just as she had once done to all who had fallen under her spell. Catherine peered into the spirit's glassy eyes and noticed something she had never expected to see there: fear. Then Catherine wiped her tears and willed herself to shed no more. She needed to keep alert. She jogged to catch up with North and Ombric. North was barreling ahead. Catherine desperately hoped to find that at least one living thing had escaped Pitch's enslavement spell. But when they neared the village in Big Root, she realized that that was not to be. Every breathing creature in Santoff Closet had been turned into a china doll, even the bear. Again, Catherine had to fight back tears. The bear looked so small and helpless now. North's horse, Petrov, was lying on his side in front of Big Root's shattered door. He looked as if he had been on his hind legs in the midst of kicking the shadows away when he had been overwhelmed by Pitch's spell. North ran to him speechless. Ombric walked among the parents and the children. They lay surrounding the tree, frozen, terrified expressions marring their faces. His fears turned to outrage as he swept into Big Root itself. The owls sat immobile on their perches around Ombric's globe. The dozens of honeybees and ants that resided in Big Root lay scattered on the floor like tiny china game pieces that tossed aside by an unruly child. Ombric and North surveyed the damage in stunned silence. The library was stripped bare. Not a single book remained. The beakers and test tubes Ombric used for his magical experiments had been dashed to the ground. No books and no children, Ombric said quietly. And where is Mr. Qwerty? Catherine came up behind him. Where was Petter, Sasha, and all the Williams? She sank to her knees, carefully brushing her insect friends to one side so they wouldn't be stepped on. Then one glittering piece of crystal caught her eye. She reached for it. Only then did she notice a sliver of blade nearby, and another and another. Her hand shook as she examined the pieces. Glistening drops like beads of light surrounded them. It's the tip of Nightlight's staff, she gasped. Ombric and North crouched beside Catherine. A small tarnished moonbeam, Nightlight's moonbeam, was hidden beneath the largest piece of the shattered blade. With great care, Catherine cupped the beam into her hands. What happened, Moonbeam? She asked gently. Where is everyone? Only Ombric spoke, Moonbeam, so he waved his staff, and suddenly the little fellow's memories were displayed on the round glass of the globe bed. The moonbeam shimmered with all the strength it could muster, and though it wavered and flickered, Ombric, North, and Catherine could see and hear the terrible story of Pitch's return. we shall hear in the next episode.